Hello, thank you for joining me for this evening's Lundy talk. I'm Michael Williams and I'm Secretary of the Lundy Field Society. Tonight I'm going to be joined by Chris D, who is going to introduce us to the subject of bird ringing and the role that it plays in helping us to understand the incredible journeys that birds make as part of their migration. Before we get started, I'll run through the usual housekeeping points for those of you who have not joined us before. And welcome to our new viewers. Only the microphones and video cameras on my computer and Chris's computer are enabled, so we won't be able to see or hear any of you watching at home. Those of you who are on Zoom are able to ask questions using the Q&A function. You'll need to click the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen and then type your question into the box that pops up. And if you're on a mobile, then you can find it on the menu bar. We'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. There's also a chat feature for comments and feedback, which I'll be monitoring during the talk. And welcome also to those of you who are watching on YouTube. I'm sorry, but unfortunately we can't interact with you, so there is no facility for asking questions. Once again, Dave Richards is behind the scenes, keeping an eye on the technology and is hosting the Zoom session, and will make a recording available afterwards. Those of you who are familiar with Lundy will recognise the Morisco Tavern behind me. I wish I was there now, but for the time being, it'll have to remain a virtual pub. But I'm very much looking forward to having a pint of old light when I can next get there again. So it's time for me to introduce our speaker, Chris D. Hopefully Chris will appear on the screen. Are you there, Chris?
Yes, I'm here.
You're there, excellent. So just a few words of introduction before Chris starts his talk. Chris has been ringing birds on Lundy since 1982 and now brings a team to the island each autumn during the peak migration season and usually also visits in April for spring migration. Chris trained as a ringer and then went on to train the next generation of ringers at a highly regarded ringing group in Hertfordshire before moving to North Devon in 2015. As the BTO regional representative for Hertfordshire for 25 years, he planned and organised bird survey work within the county. In Devon, he is now involved with pied flycatcher monitoring. He studies the house sparrow population at Exmoor Zoo and is helping to study oyster catchers and curlew on the Exe and Torrens estuaries. By profession, Chris is a software developer and now primarily builds websites for bird and wildlife charities. And he maintains the Lundy Field Society website. And he's also the newly appointed LFS treasurer. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Chris for our talk this evening. Over to you, Chris.
Brilliant. Thank you, Michael. And welcome to everybody that's joined us this evening. I'm really pleased to see so many people on through Zoom and an unknown number of people joining us through YouTube. So this evening I'm going to give a brief introduction to bird ringing and try and explain how it allows us to study birds and particularly draw relevances to the work that's going on Lundy and how bird ringing on Lundy is helping us to understand what's happening to Lundy's birds and also to study the movements of birds that are passing through Lundy on migration. Sorry, I missed the slide. Okay, so the talk this evening is going to be divided into three sections. I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of bird ringing, showing you what it's all about and how it allows us to learn about the ecology and the behaviour of birds. I'll go through a bit of a history of ringing that's taken place on Lundy and how how Lundy has helped us to understand bird movements and bird populations. And then I'll talk a little bit about some projects that are ongoing on Lundy on different species groups. So I guess the first question that many of you may be asking is what is bird ringing? If you've never heard the term before, then it may sound a little bit alien. But in its simplest form, bird ringing is the fitting of a small, very light metal ring loosely around the bird's leg. And that ring, as you can see from this illustration here, includes a unique number and an address to which anybody who finds a dead bird with a ring on should send the details of that bird. So for the UK, the scheme is administered by the British Structural Ornithology, but the address has always been used on the rings is the Natural History Museum, London Southwest 7. And surprisingly, even with today's postal service, that address is sufficient to deliver a letter telling us about a bird that's been found. So by placing an individually numbered ring around the bird's leg, it gives that bird an identity, and it allows us to know that bird if we recapture it, or if somebody else captures it, to know where it's moved to, and where it's been potentially in between. So in the UK, as elsewhere in Europe, all ringing is carried out by trained and licensed individuals. And one of the key points of that training is to ensure that the stress on the birds through doing this process is absolutely minimized. And that's critically important if we're going to use this as a scientific study, because if we can't, if bird ringing is going to have a detrimental effect on a bird's survival or its performance or its behavior, then we can't extrapolate from what the birds that we're ringing and the movements and the life histories of the birds we're ringing, we can't extrapolate that to the wild bird population as a whole, which is clearly what we're intending to do by finding out where birds go to, how long they live, how they modify their behavior in different times of their life cycle. So in order, because there is a very wide range of sizes of birds in the UK, we have access to more than 20 different ring sizes. They're each designed to fit comfortably, loosely, but comfortably around the bird's leg. So the bird can rotate around, the ring can rotate around the bird's leg, and it can move up and down, but there's not a lot of space around the ring, so they can't get a twig or a thorn or something caught between the ring and the leg. And that's obviously important because we don't want to harm the birds. The rings are very lightweight. The smaller rings are made of magnesium aluminium alloy, and rings that we would put on birds that are going to be wading in salt water, for example, oyster catchers that Michael mentioned earlier. We use a nickel chromium alloy ring for those, which is less prone to corrosion in salt water. As you've seen from the illustration on the previous slide, all the rings have a unique number and an address on them. And we have a large table that tells us which sizes of rings are appropriate for which species of bird. And very, very unusually, if we catch a bird that's not on that list, then we have the facilities to measure the bird's leg and assess what size of ring is appropriate for it. But you can see through the figures here that the weight of the ring in comparison to the bird's weight is less than 1%, and in most cases for the larger birds it's less than a tenth of a percent. And that's important to understand so the weight of the ring is less than a wristwatch on a human being, but it's not really appropriate to try to compare that, because avian or bird metabolism is very, very different to mammalian metabolism. So we would ideally keep mammals, and humans are included in that, would keep a stable weight mainly through their adult lifetime. Birds have got a very much more flexible ability to vary their weight. So certainly for migratory birds, they can add almost 50% of their body weight in fat to fuel their migration. So something like a blackcap, which is a very common British migrant bird, would weigh around 16 grams during the breeding season. And typically when we catch those birds on autumn migration on Lundy, we can catch birds up to 22 grams in weight. They're still healthy, they're still able to fly, but they're carrying 6 grams of fat, which they can lay down very quickly, and they can burn that fat to fuel the migration. So birds weight will vary much more widely. And something like a blue tit, it will gain and lose a tenth of its body weight. Certainly on cold winter nights, it will lose a tenth of its body weight. In addition to the unique metal ring, which we put on for some special projects, and that includes the house sparrow project on Lundy, which I'll talk about later, we can make use of plastic colour rings, and that allows us to observe the birds in the field and identify those birds as individuals without having to recapture them. So for small birds such as house sparrows, that would typically be just coloured plastic rings, 2 or 3 rings in combination with the metal ring, and by varying which legs we put those on and where we put the colour ring relative to the metal ring on the metal ringed leg, we can build up a big series of combinations with only using a small number of colours. For larger birds, such as this Leicester black-backed gull, you can see here, the rings are obviously a little bit bigger, and that allows us to use to have an inscription on the ring, which can be read in the field, typically with a with a telescope. It just means that for birds which are difficult to recapture, and house sparrows in particular are difficult to recapture, we can identify them in the field without having to recatch them. So why do we ring birds? Well, historically, from when ringing was first started in UK in 1909, the main interest was to discover where our summer migrants spend the winter. People knew that birds turned up in the summer and they disappeared in the winter, but nobody really knew where they went to. And similarly, winter migrants arrived, redwings and fieldfares arrived in September or October and disappeared in March, and we didn't know where they were coming from or going to in the rest of the year. So this map on the left-hand side here shows all the what we call recoveries. This is birds that have been recaptured or with a ring on, or found dead with a ring on, that were ringed that have been ringed in the UK. So all those blue dots show locations of swallows that were ringed in the UK, where they've been found at other points in the year. So primarily in the winter, they spend 3 or 4 months of the winter in South Africa and make that journey all up through Africa, across the Sahara, across the Mediterranean, up through Iberia, back into Britain the following summer. And sometimes, and for swallows, they will go back to exactly the same place where they bred the year before. And we can know that by recapturing the bird and recognizing the ring number. So that was the original kind of motivation for birdering, is to find out where birds came from and went to. But with increased sophistication of technique and the ability to catch more birds, which I'll allude to in a moment, there are some more reasons now, and perhaps some better scientific reasons for ringing birds, particularly to track changes in timings and patterns of migration. So it's kind of tempting to think that after ringing birds for 100 years, starting in 1909, we know all there is to know about bird migration. But there are lots of factors affecting birds' migration, and they're able to modify their behavior and their migratory patterns to cope with those changes. So environmental changes such as climate change, such as differing food availability. Birds have got quite a plastic migratory strategy, and if a change in that migratory strategy ends up being successful, then they evolve that strategy, and it's inherited by their offspring. So this map on the right hand side shows typical black cap migration strategy followed by the green arrows. So blackcaps, a small warbler that breeds across the UK, migrates down through Spain and France into North Africa for the winter and comes back again in the spring. But there's been an increasing tendency, starting in about the 1990s, for blackcaps to be seen in people's gardens in the winter. And it was only through ringing that we were able to discover that they were not British breeding birds that were staying on for the winter, because there was an adequate food supply, with people providing winter feeding in the gardens, fat balls, and burying shrubs. But these were birds which bred in Central Europe and had developed this east-west migration strategy and continue to do so. And that offspring of birds which are doing that east-west migration also exhibit that tendency. So it's almost a new pattern of migration, potentially eventually a new species which is evolving through differential migration. We can also use ringing now to monitor survival rates and breeding success. So using a project called the Constant Effort Site Scheme, by using the same catching regime once every 11 days through May through August, the same catching technique, repeat that every year, we got a direct comparison between the number of birds present in a particular area in one year to the next year. So these two graphs here show what we've been able to discover from this. I mean, this is reasonably well known that through distribution studies that willow warbler numbers are declining in the UK and chiffchaff numbers are increasing. So these are two very similar, very closely related warbler species. The willow warbler is a long distance migrant, crosses the Sahara to winter in sub-Saharan Africa, whereas the chiffchaff mainly only goes down to the Mediterranean basin for the winter. So the long distance migrant is struggling and its numbers are declining in the UK. It's not declining at the same rate across the whole of the UK, but definitely on the decline. And chiffchaff numbers are on the increase and doing very well. The other thing that we can tell from using this constant effort regime is we can detect changes in productivity, number of offspring that particular birds produce, one particular species produce from one year to the next. So for most songbird species, using a variety of characteristics, when we've got the bird in the hand to ring it, we can tell the difference from between an adult bird and a juvenile bird, a bird that was hatched that year. And by counting the numbers of birds in those two categories, we can get a good feel for how good a breeding season it's been for each species. And there's about 120, 130 of these constant effort sites across the UK. And by pooling the data from all those sites, we can get a good measure of productivity and breeding success for a wide range of species. The other thing that we can learn now through ringing, by combining ringing with other studies such as nest recording, we can understand how populations change and they respond to changing environments. So this slide here shows some graphs of work that's gone on pied flycatchers. The first two graphs show data come from recording nests through observing pied flycatcher breeding attempts, and that's quite easy because pied flycatchers are very easy to monitor because they take to nest boxes very well. But the graph on the left shows over the past 45 years, how the first egg laying date of pied flycatchers has advanced by 10 days. Now, it's almost certainly in direct response to climate change. As pied flycatchers are able to breed, they're able to get to the UK earlier. Their primary food source is insects. So insects are, this will be defoliating moths really. So the caterpillars on the oak trees are hatching earlier with warmer springs. and that's providing the food for pie flycatchers earlier than it was 45 years ago. The second graph also shows data from nests, which is the nest failure rate, which is slightly increasing over time. So birds are not, even though they're breeding earlier, their survival rate of the chicks is not as great. So there's always a kind of balance between starting to breed early and risking not having enough food. And that's a little bit of an indication of what's happening here. But the final slide on the right-hand side is shows year-to-year adult survival of pie flycatchers, mainly because pie flycatchers are coming back to the same nests year after year. They'll breed in the same woodland, if not the same nest box. We can recapture those birds, record the ring number, and we can then get a feel for how many birds are coming back year on year. So in order to ring birds, we need to catch them, and we need to be able to catch them safely, because we don't want to harm them. So in the first 50 years of ringing, so up until the mid-1950s, most birds were ringed as chicks in the nest. Various ingenious cage traps were developed to try and catch adult birds, but most birds were ringed as nestlings in the nest. From the mid to late 1950s, mist nets became available, and that is now our primary method of catching birds. It makes it much easier to catch large numbers of birds, but it also means that much more experience is needed in order to ensure the welfare of the birds. So additional training is required for us to be able to extract birds from mist nets to ensure that we don't harm them in any way. And it's also necessary to develop the experience with using mist nets to know how many nets we can operate safely, to ensure that we're not catching more birds than we can handle, can deal with, can process, can ring and measure in the time that we've got in a minimum amount of time that we've got to hold the birds. The way that mist nets are constructed, and the way that they're set up, means that birds don't really get tangled in the nets. The whole point of the mist net is the bird hits the vertical part of the net and falls into a pocket in the net. And the pocket in the net keeps its wings closed, so it can't flutter out of the net. But generally speaking, the birds just lie there in the net and wait for something to happen to them. And what happens to them is that a ringer would come along, quickly extract them, take them from out of the net, and we will put them into a little cloth bag to keep them calm while we take them back to a processing base where we will go through the ringing process. So the mist nets are normally set between two vertical poles in a place where birds are going to fly through, and that's kind of a lot of the skill of ringers is getting a feel for where to set nets and where birds are going to fly. And the nets are checked regularly, every 20 to 30 minutes, to make sure that the birds are not kept from feeding or whatever other activity they're involved with, particularly if they're breeding. If we're setting mist nets in an area where birds are breeding, we'd be checking them more frequently than that, because we don't want to keep them away off the nest or from feeding their young. The other constraint with mist nets is that they're not usable in rain or wind, because if the birds are laying in one of these pockets in the net and it's raining, they're going to get wet and can get chilled quite quickly. So we can't use the mist nets in those conditions. And also, if it's very windy, the net will blow around and you potentially risk the bird getting caught in two parts of the net and damaging itself. So there are very strict rules about when we're able to use mist nets, which on a place like Lundy makes it quite challenging, because rain and wind are quite common on Lundy. We can also use other methods of catching birds, such as Heligoland traps, which are kind of cage traps that encourage birds to into a kind of funnel There's a catching box at the far end, and these two photos show the existing, well, it's not quite in that good condition, trap on the terrace on Lundy at the top, and the now dismantled quarter wall trap at the bottom. So these were traps that were run on Lundy quite successfully for catching birds when it was not possible to use mist nets. You can also use spring traps for catching ground feeding birds, other kinds of cage traps designed specifically for other species. And also you can catch birds by hand. So a lot of the work on Manx Shearwaters on Lundy is done by catching them by hand. The adult birds come ashore in the spring prospecting for burrows, and you can wander around on the slopes in the dark and pick them up if you're confident of doing it. And in the autumn, the young birds, they will come out of the burrows to exercise their wings, and also build a star map in their mind by looking at the star patterns in the sky, and they will use that to navigate subsequently. But yes, we can pick up the chicks, typically ring them. We obviously need to be very careful that we're leaving them outside the burrow that we found them at, and typically they will scamper off down the burrow once we've ringed them. So the process of ringing really is quite straightforward. We need to identify the bird to species, fit the ring of the correct size, determine its age and sex, collect some basic measurements such as wing length and weight, and assess some conditions. Particularly on migration, we will look at how much fat the birds are carrying, and during the autumn we will also look at the stage of molt. So most birds replace their flight feathers after they've bred, either in the UK or on their wintering grounds, and that gives us an indication of what stage they are at relative to the time at which they bred. So I think I've touched on most of this already, but it's important to know that we consider the health and the safety of birds to be absolutely paramount, and we want to avoid interrupting the birds' normal activities as little as possible, whilst using ringing to gain important scientific information about their ecology. We need to make sure the nets and traps are tracked regularly, and we do keep track of the ring numbers that we're using on a particular day. So if we recapture a bird for a second time that day, we would let that go immediately. Yes, I've said we take them back to a base of processing. That means we can be efficient about processing, and actually put together a team and work together to make sure the birds are released as soon and as safely as possible. So it's all about really maximizing the information we can collect for the minimum time that we've got the bird in captivity. So I hope I don't need to explain to everybody on this call where Lundy is. It's 11 miles off the North Devon coast, accessible from Bideford or Ilfracombe most years. Unfortunately, not this year. We're all very sad about that. And the winter helicopter service from Heartland. The Lundy Field Society was formed in 1946, and the year after the Bird Observatory was established at the Old Light, and it became part of a network of bird observatories across the UK, whose primarily aim is to do systematic recording of bird numbers and bird movements across the United Kingdom, and to collate all that information together so we can get a good feel for the timing of migration, the numbers of birds on migration, and the conditions that affect the migratory patterns of birds. The first Heligolands were built in the 1949-1950, but it was really the availability of mist nets in the 1950s that changed the focus of Lundy ringing from primarily seabird ringing to migrant warbler, passerine ringing. And there was a realization that the position of Lundy and its attractiveness to migrant birds during both the spring and autumn migrations made it an ideal place to study that migration and to use ringing as a tool to do that. There's been in the early days, the warden was funded by the Lundy Field Society. After a bit of a hiatus in the late 60s, it was reinstated with help from Landmark Trust. And between 1975 and 1991, there were island staff who were usually the barmen and who were also ringers. And I'd like to think that Grant Sherman, who I'm sure is on the call tonight, has followed on in that tradition of running the bar and studying birds on Lundy at the same time. So the current warden, there was some support from Natural England from 1996 through to 2015, but funding cutbacks there has meant that the warden is now primarily funded by the Landmark Trust with occasional support from the Lundy Field Society. This diagram, or this map, shows where the bird observatories are across the UK, and you can see Lundy as this yellow dot here is a real ideal place within that network between Skocum on the Pembrokeshire Islands and Portland in Dorset, and we regularly get birds on migration. Willow warblers in particular will follow a western track up the west coast of the UK in the spring, and we regularly get birds ringed at Portland and recaptured on Lundy or from Lundy to Skocum. And although Lundy is not currently a member of the Bird Observatories network, there are negotiations led by Dean Jones, the warden, to try and get Lundy readmitted to the Bird Observatories network, and that's really good move, really enthusiastic about that. So the current ringing arrangements on Lundy, so since 1973, most of the migration ringing has been done by visiting volunteer ringers in the spring and the autumn, primarily in the walled gardens at the bottom of Milcombe, but also up St John's Valley, in that narrow valley, that kind of low valley that goes up towards the church from Bramble Villa, and that can be very good. But the birds congregate in those areas because that's essentially where most of the trees and most of the food supply for migrant birds is on Lundy. So yes, that's mainly where most of the migrant ringing takes place. Again, very dependent upon weather. So luckily Milcombe is quite sheltered from most winds on Lundy, but a strong easterly really means that we can't do any work there. So the most commonly ringed species, you could tell that see the difference here between the proportions of birds coming through Lundy in the spring and the autumn. So willow warbler is the #1 migrant coming through Lundy, moving north in the spring. Less willow warblers ringed in the autumn. There is possibly an observer bias here in that most willow warblers do leave the UK quite early, so mid-August onwards, and we don't generally have migrant ringers on the island ringing migrants in August. So I think when Lundy does get readmitted to Bird Observatory network and Dean is able to spend more time ringing, hopefully, Kira's Lundy company, then we will start to understand a little bit more about the timing of southward willow warbler migration. Blackcaps, a lot of blackcaps in the spring and the autumn. Chiffchaffs about equal numbers. Goldcrest, really don't get any goldcrest moving through Lundy northwards in the spring. Obviously in the autumn there are more goldcrests in the population because they've all bred, you know, and there's 5 or 6 new baby goldcrests for every pair of goldcrests that started breeding. So there are more goldcrests to move south, but Lundy can be a real haven for goldcrests in the autumn. You know, can get days when there are several hundred goldcrests milling around Milcombe. Swallows, again, and definitely a breeding season effect here because there's a lot more swallows moving south, and this is also biased by the time at which I generally tend to go to Lundy in late September, which is the peak time of swallow migration. Just show that the total numbers of birds we ring on Lundy varies quite a bit, but generally only 40 or 50 different species ringed each year. Although if you look back over the full course of ringing back to 1947, we've ringed a lot more species. Some of those are just single occurrences of very rare birds, but ringing is not really about catching rare birds. It's about ringing large numbers of common birds, because the chance of one of these birds with a ring on being recaptured is so small that it's only by ringing large numbers that we can play the averages really, and have a chance of finding out what one individual has done. So a little bit on projects going on in Lundy. So there's a lot of work going on with migrant birds, and it's really only can really only touch on the kind of studies that we're able to, or the results we're able to glean from ringing large numbers of birds on Lundy in the spring and autumn. But there's a recent analysis by Tony Taylor, who organises the ringing on Lundy of Goldcrest ring. So it's ringing 6,000 Goldcrest rings on Lundy between 1990 and 2018. And what we were able to find out was that males move earlier in the spring. So the first birds to come through in the spring are males, and the last birds to move south through Lundy in the autumn are also the males. The birds don't stay on Lundy for very long. They just have a couple of days, cumulative feeding, they maintain their weight, and then move on overnight. Goldcrests migrate overnight primarily, so they'll feed during the day, and then the next evening or the night after that, they'll be off on the next stage of their journey. And we've got no evidence that the larger, slightly larger birds from continental Europe ever make their way to Lundy. So most of the birds on Lundy are birds from the northern Britain, Scottish and Irish breeding populations probably. The meadow pipits that migrate through Lundy also get mixed up with the large number of meadow pipits that breed on Lundy. And by looking at the Moult on their wings, we are hopeful. We've got some data that we are leading us to think that we can use differences in the Moult strategy between these different classes of birds, will allow us to differentiate between birds that were bred on Lundy and birds that are migrating through Lundy. And in this picture here, you can see that this is a young meadow pipit, and it's got feathers here of two different ages. So in these middle feathers in the wing, which are called the greater coverts, these paler tipped feathers on the outside are feathers which it grew in the nest, and these much more ginger edged feathers, and these feathers here, which are the tertials, are birds which it molted in after it had fledged the nest. So most passerine birds will molt some of their wing feathers, not their flight feathers, but some of these smaller feathers in the wing in their first autumn. And that's one of the characteristics that we can use to differentiate adult birds from young birds. I think it's all good.
Yeah. Can I just interrupt you, Chris, and give you a sort of 5-minute warning?
Yes.
Thank you.
There is only 5 minutes left. Okay. So I think it would be remiss of me not to, if I'm talking about birds on Lundy, not to talk about the Manx Shearwaters. So the survey work in the 80s revealed that although Manx Shearwaters were attempting to breed, very few were actually being successful. And I won't go into the story of the rat eradication and the Seabird recovery project, but we're now sure now that there are several thousand pairs of Manx Shearwaters breeding on Lundy, nothing like the hundreds of thousands of pairs that breed on the Pembrokeshire Islands, but Lundy's getting there. And we know now that birds which were ringed as chicks on Lundy are coming back to breed as breeding adults. They don't breed for 2 years, their first 2 years. So when they're definitely coming back to breed now. And we've only been able to show that through chicks that we ringed on Lundy are now being recaptured as adults. Ringing also allows us to understand where these Manx Shearwaters are dispersing to. So we occasionally get birds that have been ringed on Lundy and captured on the Pembrokeshire Island colonies. But more importantly, it allows us to see where they're going in the winter. So we know that Manx shearwaters very quickly after leaving their breeding colony, and which we've had one example here of 44 days later, a Lundy ringed Manx shearwater was found in southern Brazil, got caught up in a very severe storm and unfortunately died, but just shows how quickly these magnificent birds can make the journey from their northern hemisphere breeding colonies to their southern hemisphere winter locations. Obviously, as a result of the Seabird Recovery Project, puffin numbers are increasing, and we now have a small number of storm petrels breeding on Lundy, and there's also ringing work going on to understand how they are moving between colonies. There's a in the Bristol Channel and off the southwest coast of Britain, there's a lot of storm petrels move around in the summer. They're not necessarily breeding birds, but all these locations here are places where birds were captured on Lundy. This is where birds had been ringed. Lundy is an ideal kind of closed population of house sparrows, so it's almost an experimental site for studying house sparrows, and there were ongoing studies by a succession of PhD students from Sheffield University and Imperial College that are running a series of projects to understand how a small population of house sparrows is potentially evolving. They've all got life histories. We know the pedigree and the life history for almost every individual house sparrow on Lundy for the past 15 years. So we know who's related to who's breeding with who, and those kind of things, which allows us to do some very interesting analysis. I'll skip over the next slide. We're also doing a Wheatear breeding study. This is a retrapping adults for survival project where we're colouring Wheatears, catching them in spring traps, and then resighting them in following years to see what proportion are coming back to the island. And we've got very good return rates. So these year-to-year survival figures of over 50% are very good compared to other Wheatear studies that are going on in the UK. And you can help with this if you're on the island, clearly not this year, but if you're on the island in the summer in the future and you see Wheatear with colouring on them, please do seek to see the whole of the combination, which will be a striped ring on the leg where the metal ring is, then two different colours on the other leg, and that will allow us to identify which bird that is. And one individual that just really showed the migratory journey of one particular individual. One of these colouring birds in March 2017 was observed on Guernsey. It had been ringed as a male, breeding male, in June 2015, and then 11 days later, in the spring of 2017, it was back on its regular Lundy breeding territory. So it just shows how quickly that bird moved up through southern Britain. Just I need to a little bit about how training and licensing of ringers work. Training takes several years and a substantial time commitment. It's all administered by the British Structural Ornithology, who issues licenses on behalf of the government. And I'd like to thank the Lundy Field Society for supporting some of the ringing. The LFS pays for all the Manx Shearwater and storm petrel rings, and it's really good that they can do that. So bird ringing, hopefully I've demonstrated that bird ringing is a powerful tool that allows us to monitor changes to bird populations and explain why these occur. And despite the fact that we've been ringing birds in the UK for over 100 years, there's still much more to learn. So thank you very much for listening. I think now we can do Michael, who will handle any questions.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Chris. Really interesting to see how all the importance really of the bird ringing on Lundy and its implication for our understanding of bird migration and avifauna, I think is the word in general, isn't it?
Avifauna, yes.
We've got lots of questions come in, so if you haven't asked your question yet, then please do click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to take the first question from Lorraine Wood to sort of pick up on what you were saying towards the end there. But how does one begin to learn to be a bird ringer?
You need to find someone who has the capacity to train you. And there is a finder trainer web page on the BTO's website. So go to bto.org and you can actually find out more about bird ringing there and actually find where there are qualified trainers in your area. It helps if you have got some knowledge of birds and some identification skills to start with, although that's not a necessary prerequisite, but it certainly means that you progress through the training a lot more quickly. And I think the other thing that challenges some people is you need to be able to get up early. Most bird activity happens in the 2 or 3 hours after dawn. So catching birds in June means that you're setting and or opening mist nets at something like 4 o'clock in the morning. So if you're not a quote early bird, then it's quite challenging to learn to ring because you can't get up early enough. But yeah, it takes time. I mean, it takes time and patience. So don't expect to get anywhere near to being able to ring independently in less than 2 years.
That leads quite nicely into a question from Clive Smith, who is a bell ringer, not a bird ringer.
Okay. So
he's asked, well, what time of day do you start, and how long do you normally operate for?
We start at first light typically and operate as long as there is bird activity, really. So on some days on Lundy, in the autumn, bird activity just drops off after an hour, and we can close up the nets so they're safe and they don't catch birds, and we just go bird watching then. But on some days we can get swallows coming through the island continually from 10 o'clock to 4 o'clock, and it can be pretty hectic then.
Thank you. I've got a question from Richard Campy. So Richard was one of the barmen that you mentioned.
Yes.
Hello, Richard. Thank you for joining us. He says, "Hi, Chris. What is the most unexpected bird species you have taken from a mist net on Lundy? And also, what is the bird species you have most enjoyed ringing?"
So the most unexpected, because it hadn't been seen before and was not seen after, was a little bunting. It was kind of unexpected in that I wasn't expecting to catch it, but it was obvious what it was as soon as I saw it in the net. So that was a little bunting. I don't know about the most I've enjoyed ringing. That's a difficult question, really, because it kind of assumes that ringing rare birds is an enjoyable exercise. I suppose the one which I was most pleased to have caught and ringed, I think, was a juvenile rose-coloured starling, because very few rose-coloured starlings have been ringed in the UK, and that was one example where rose-coloured starling is not on the ring size list, but it's same size as a starling, so it was a no-brainer as to what size ring it was going to take. But thank you, Richard.
So that leads very nicely into a question from our own Dave Richards. He says, "Are there any birds which are never ringed?"
Yes, we can't ring pheasants, but then I'm not sure you'd want to, and red-legged partridges as introduced species, really. Pheasants because of the spur on the leg would get caught up in the ring, but no, basically any bird that we catch in the nets, assuming we have the correct ring size for it, then we will ring, yes.
And John Tyra, John is doing very well for getting a question in every week. He says, "Are auks ringed as well? And if so, how do you capture them?"
Yeah, so at the moment there is no seabird ringing going on Lundy, and I think it's something that I'd be quite keen to restart, and I think Dean Warden is also quite keen to do that. But no, there are no auks ringed on Lundy at the moment. Yes, they're tricky to catch, particularly on cliffs like Lundy. I mean, some places there will be razorbill nests that will be accessible, but you also need a special endorsement on the ringing license to be able to catch cliff nesting seabirds, because the risk of disturbing a colony of guillemots and then potentially knocking the eggs off of the cliffs is too great really to really approach those kind of colonies. So where auk ringing does take place, it typically takes place on the edges of the colonies where it can be done safely without disturbing the rest of the colony. But yes, there is none going on Lundy at the moment, unfortunately.
Thank you. I've got a question from Colin McShane. It's good to hear from you, Colin. He says, thanks, Chris, for bringing us back so many brilliant memories of ringing on Lundy. Wonder if you can fill in any details of the proposed observatory status.
Yes, so Dean Jones and I went to the annual meeting of the Observatories Council at Thetford on the 1st of February this year, to basically for Dean to pitch to the BOC for Lundy to be made a bird observatory. The response was very positive. I think they need to be sure that we've got things set up to provide the regular systematic recording that would qualify Lundy as a bird observatory. And apart from that, if you look across the whole of the bird observatory network, there are so many different models. Each bird observatory has a different kind of modus operandi. So I think apart from the regular recording, I don't think there'll be any problem with Lundy fitting into that. There are obviously questions to be answered about how that will fit in with the Lundy Company and the Landmark Trust, but they've initial discussions have gone on between Dean and Derek Green, as far as I'm aware. But yeah, it's looking very positive.
Great, thank you. Just a message from Gary Bridge, who says, cheers, Chris and Michael, very interesting and enjoyable. Loving these tidbits of Lundy. I've got a really good question here from Ellen Bolton. I think I would have asked this question myself. Do you know what the oldest bird is that has been recaptured on Lundy?
Off the top of my head, no. But there's a fair. There are going to be Manx Shearwaters probably over 30 years old. I mean, the record age for Manx Shearwater is one that has been retracked on Bardsey Island off Wales, and that was at 50 years old. So Manx Shearwaters have got enormous capacity to keep going for many years. So no, but it's going to have to be a Manx Shearwater probably, because the other long-lived birds, the other seabirds, are not being ringed or recaptured at the moment. But I don't know the precise age. Sorry.
I'm always fascinated when the Lundy Field Society annual report comes out to look at the controls and the recoveries, to see how much time has elapsed between the ringing and the recovery. We'll move on. I have a question from Louisa Cook, who says, I remember drag netting close to the airstrip with my dad, Cyril Matthews, on my first trip to Lundy in the 90s. Is drag netting still carried out on the island?
We sometimes try in when we're over in September, not without much success recently. I think in the early 90s, the grazing pressure from rabbits was higher, so there was a lot more suitable areas for drag netting. So no, we've not been successful in drag netting anything the last few times we've tried. But that's interesting, because when I first started ringing on Lundy in the early 80s, it was with a team that included Cyril. So please pass on my regards and my thanks to Cyril for inducting me into ringing on Lundy.
Let's follow that up with a question from Tim Pett. Tim's another bell ringer, although he doesn't admit to it on here. He says, what percentage of birds ringed on spring migration are recaptured on autumn migration in the same year?
Close to zero, if not zero. I think it's likely that most birds take a different route south, but yeah, I don't think I'm aware of any bird that I've caught in the spring and the autumn. I've caught a few meadow pipits in the autumn in successive years, and it's quite possible they were local Lundy breeding birds rather than migrants.
So Tim Hambley has a sort of follow-up question for that, which sort of expands the scope of it. And he says, do you have any idea of what proportion of ringed birds are recovered or seen again, especially ones which have long migrations?
So basically, the longer the migration distance, the less, and the smaller the bird, the less chance it is that the bird is going to be found dead. So most re-encounters with migrant birds such as willow warblers and chiffchaffs will be birds recaptured at another ringing site, at particularly another bird observatory. And even there, you're probably looking at 1 in 200 willow warblers is ever encountered again.
I can sort of follow up on that as well with a question from John Harmon. Good to see that you're here, John. How good is the observation of ringed birds worldwide? And do people typically report dead birds and their locations?
That's interesting. I mean, there is a lot of interest amongst bird watchers in reporting colouring birds, particularly amongst gull watchers. So there are people from Europe who spend their holidays or spend winter holidays down in North Africa searching for ringed lesser blackback gulls, for example. There is some evidence from looking at the recovery rates that the BTO has done that public interest in reporting dead birds or even looking at dead birds for rings is dwindling. And this is something which every time I get the opportunity to do so, as I am today, to encourage people, if they do find a dead bird, to check it to see whether it's got a ring on it. I think philosophically, I think the general public is a bit more squeamish about dead things these days than they used to be in the past. But yeah, so the recovery rate of ringed songbirds is declining, and the public reporting rate is definitely getting lower, yes.
So David Bagley, hello David, he asks, is there an online resource for checking ringed birds to find out where they might have come from? For
colouring birds, there is a website, CR Birding, that allows you to look up the project that the colouring is done. No, there isn't an online resource for looking up, for example, a BTO metal ringed bird, and the primary reason for that is because we don't want to risk losing that record. So if somebody can find out everything they want to know about a ringed bird just by looking it up on a website, then there's a risk that they won't go any further than that and report it, and therefore it won't contribute to the database that the BTO uses to assess mortality rates in birds. Different countries work it differently. So in Norway, there's a Norwegian website that you can do it, but you can report it through the website, and then you get notification back afterwards. But no, we don't want to risk losing the observation through somebody just looking up the ring number on a website and never telling us about it.
So Jan Paul asks about how you're recording the rings that you've used, and she asks, do you log each ring used at the time in a notebook or online?
It's recorded in a paper notebook at the time of recording. and that includes the ring number, the age and sex of the bird, if we know it, its wing length and its weight and its molt state and fat condition, also the time, and which area the time we caught it and which area we caught it in, and then that is all subsequently entered onto a database at the BGO through a web interface. But the primary recording in the field is done in a notebook, and that makes sure that we don't lose it if the computer goes down, or we lose a internet connection from Lundy to the rest of the world.
Yes, Lundy's internet connection, as we were finding out last week, is not always very reliable.
No.
Another question from Ellen Bolton here, who says, I'm currently training for my bird ringing license.
Oh,
do you
well
ever have trainees when you ring in the spring and autumn on Lundy? And
yes.
She says, thank you so much for this excellent evening. Thank you, Ellen.
I do. I mean, if you happen to be there while I've got a team there, then you're very welcome to join us. As is anyone anyone who's on Lundy while we're ringing, you're extremely welcome to come and see what we're doing. We don't want to keep what we're doing secret. No, I tend to take a balance of experiences of ringers in my teams I take in the autumn. Basically, because particularly when we're catching large numbers of swallows, we can get pretty busy, and we need to have a lot of experience there. But we can always accommodate trainees, and if you want to get in touch with me through Michael, yeah, we can try and set something up if you know when you're going to be there. I can't predict when. I mean, I have time booked for this September, which I don't even know whether I'm going to get to Lundy for. I've also got a trip booked for September 2021, so I haven't yet built the team for that. So
yes, if anybody who is a train ringer is interested in ringing on Lundy, then just drop me a line, and I can put you in touch with the bird ringers. I'm going to bring the conversation around to birds again rather than the actual ringing process. So Gareth Davis. Hello, Gareth, another bell ringer. There's quite a lot of bell ringers on here this evening. Gareth says, how big is the house sparrow population, and has it been stable over the last 15 years?
I wonder if we got the title of this talk right, if we've attracted a lot of bell ringers. No, the house sparrow population does go up and down, and probably on the slide that I had to skip over. Most often the population is depleted when a sparrowhawk or two happens to winter on the island, because they can hunt around the lambing shed and they can feed on house sparrows quite nicely. So the population, I think it dropped. Oh goodness, there was a time back in the early 2000s when the population dropped to somewhere between 20 and 30 pairs, because they had 2 sparrowhawks on the island the previous winter. But yeah, it does fluctuate a bit, but mainly only due to predation. I think there seems to be enough food there for them at the moment, although we don't really know what's going on this year because nobody's been able to get out. I'm in touch with the sparrow researcher who was planning to go out this year, but we're going to miss most of the nestlings, unfortunately. So there'll be a whole year's worth of chicks that we won't have life histories for.
Gareth would like me to point out that he is also a bird ringer and a bell ringer.
A bird ringer and a bell ringer. That's an interesting combination. I've not come across that before.
So we'll take the last 2 or 3 questions now. Sarah Booth says, she asks, what has been the largest bird that has been ringed on Lundy? Testing your memory here, Chris.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, I'm not, without looking up, I'm not sure if any swans have ever been ringed on Lundy, but no, I can't answer that
Well,
without
why
getting
you
up and
continue
think.
to rack your brains, I've got another question from Richard Campy,
Okay.
who says, what's the most long distance migrant recorded away from Lundy?
I think we have had swallows to South Africa, and the Manx Shearwaters to the coast of South America will be the longest distance birds.
And I've got a question from Peter Long. Sorry, Peter, I've only just spotted your question and it's been sitting here for a while. He says, have any choughs been ringed or tracked back to Lundy? And he's wondering whether the Cornish or Welsh populations will seed the island.
Yeah, we're hopeful. There's been only one record in recent years. About 4 or 5 years ago, was a chough on, yeah, must be at least 5 years ago. So I think it was before Dean arrived on the island. Spent about 2 weeks on the island and left the day before I went out on my ringing trip. Almost certainly potentially from the Cornish or Pembrokeshire populations. But yeah, it's a potential breeding species for Lundy, but there are efforts going in to encourage them onto the North Devon coast as well. So National Trust have put up nest boxes for choughs several places along the North Devon coast, but as yet they've not been taken up. But that would be a potential jumping off point for birds to colonise Lundy. But no, none choughs have been ringed on Lundy.
Thank you. I'm conscious there are still quite a few questions which we haven't been able to ask, but it's time to wrap up. We've had a few messages of thanks as well. The most recent one here from Susan Wells, who says, fascinating talk, thank you very much. I saw my first grasshopper warbler in the hands of a ringer on Lundy. Wonderful, she says. Thanks for getting in touch, Susan.
Thank you.
So, as I say, time to wrap up. A few things to mention as before we close down. Of course, thank you very much, Chris, for joining us this evening and for your really interesting talk. And thank you also to Dave Richards, who has hosted the Zoom session again this evening. And of course, this evening you'll have heard the Lundy Field Society mentioned many times. Bird ringing is only one part of the research and conservation work that we support. And I'm hoping that we're going to have a talk about the volunteer working holidays that take place on Lundy in a few weeks' time. So look out for that. Of course, you can support the work of the Lundy Field Society. Membership is open to all, and you don't have to have any specialised interest to join. If you just search online for Lundy Field Society, and you'll find our website, and you can find more details about how to join there. So please do support the LFS. Next Tuesday, I have a slightly different talk planned. John Tyra and Philip Limbury will be here to talk about their Lundy photography and offer hints and tips for taking good photos of the Lundy landscape and the wildlife on Lundy. So I hope you can join us for that. Details will be posted on the Lundy Island Facebook page, and I'll email LFS members as usual. Keith Hiscock will be here in 2 weeks, and the title of his talk is Lundy's Hidden World, History and Marine Life Beneath the Waves. So another one to look forward to. And then I can also announce, and hopefully if I do this properly, I can share my screen. So we're having a bonus, a bank holiday bonus, as I've called it. So on Sunday, something a little bit different. On Sunday evening, I'm going to show a 1966 film about Lundy from the days when it was still owned by the Harmon family. It'll be at the slightly earlier time of 6:30, and I'll post details in the usual places. So, like previous weeks, when this webinar ends, those of you watching on Zoom will receive an email containing a link to a very short feedback survey. If you can complete that, it will help me improve these talks. And also thank you to everyone who has completed them in previous weeks. So that's just about it. Chris, would you like to say your goodbyes?
Yes, goodbye everyone. Thank you very much for listening, and particularly for the excellent series of questions. It really, I hope that helped you to fill in the gaps that I'd left out of the talk.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris. And that's it from us. Thank you everyone for your company and your questions this evening. I hope you've enjoyed it. And I look forward to seeing you again next week. Bye-bye.